Hello and welcome to this webinar on the 2016 CERCLL Grant, Repatriation and Tribesourcing of Yaqui Easter Films from 1972. I'm Jennifer Jenkins, an associate professor in the Department of English and curator of the American Indian Film Gallery. My project partners are Guillermo Quiroga, director of Old Pascua Museum and Yaqui Cultural Center, and Hani Nabahe, a recent graduate of the School of Information with a master's in Library and Information Science and an MBA candidate at the Eller School. This project was a partnership between the University of Arizona and the Old Pascua Museum and Yaqui Cultural Center. The three of us came together from our different areas of expertise. I'm a film historian and I work in preservation of moving image artifacts. Hani was one of my students in moving image preservation, and Guillermo hosted Hani as an intern when Hani was in library school working on the still image resources at the Old Pascua Museum and Yaqui Cultural Center. So when these two reels of film showed up, Hani brought me and Guillermo together to talk about what should be done with them. Old Pascua Museum and Yaqui Culture Center are located in the same building in Old Pascua Village between Oracle Road and I-10, just south of Grant Road, and all of that is north of downtown Tucson. The village is on land that was set aside by a realtor to be sold to the Yaqui through consent and negotiation with the city in the early part of the 20th century. The one thing that the general public may know about the Yaqui is that they conduct extensive religious ceremonies throughout the Lenten period, culminating in Semana Santa, the Holy Week leading to Easter Sunday. And indeed, this is so important to the Yaqui people that this village is actually named after Easter. It's called Pascua. So this is an extremely sacred, holy, and protected time in the village all through the period of Lent. And because of the esteem with which the Yaqui people hold this entire ritual, no recording of any kind is allowed, not still photographs, not moving images, and not audio recordings. The fact that both still and moving image recordings have been made of the ceremony is to some extent the focus of this project. In 1972, National Geographic came into the village and shot 2 reels of 16mm film, presumably for television broadcast, and there was quite a bit of disagreement within the community about whether this should be permitted or not. There was permission by traditional leaders because the National Geographic promised money, and it was a very hard time for the Yaqui Village at Pascua, and people felt like, you know, they needed to take the money. Older and more traditional people disagreed and were resistant to that, but they were overruled by people who wanted to go ahead with the filming. These films were found recently and digitized, and their repatriation is the focus of this project. Just to give you a little bit of context, from the beginnings of photography as a recording practice, people had been taking pictures and then after that moving images of native peoples as exotica and curiosities. So at this point, there are numerous sacred images in public collections. Many of them have not yet been identified, but many have. On the left here, we have James Mooney's still image of the Arapaho Ghost Dance, which was part of a religious revival that swept across the West in the period of the reservations and containment. And these are people who were not photographed with their permission, who are in the middle of religious trance. And as you can tell from the formatting of the image, this is something that was turned into a postcard and sold without, of course, any required releases or any permission on the behalf of the people pictured in the image. On the right is something slightly different, which is people performing the buffalo dance for Edison's cameras at the 1894 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. These are people who were clearly well aware that they were being filmed. It was a demonstration dance. I'm not sure they were paid for it, and I'm not sure that the full implications of informed consent were carried out. But nonetheless, the people are very well aware that they're being filmed. They're on a stage, and the figure in the center of the frame is looking at the camera, and even as he's dancing, he keeps turning his head to look at the camera. So that's a slightly different kind of performance and capture of sacred images. And the buffalo dance may or may not be considered a sacred image as it's danced here. It may have been adapted for public consumption. But as far back as the moving image exists in cultural history, we have these kinds of recordings. So we need to be mindful of how they're handled and who gets to see them. And that is the concern of 21st century archivists and Native peoples whose images may not be within their control. This is a quick timeline of Yaqui history that gives you a pretty brief idea of how the people have moved and in response to what kinds of colonial and settler colonial processes. The first contact with Spaniards in 1533 is really only 14 years after the Spanish entered Mexico. The 1880s, there was quite a purge, an intentional purge in northern Sonora to expel the Yaquis, either to capture them and send them to work camps in southern Mexico, or just simply to deport them to the United States. So in the mid-1880s, Yaquis began moving north across the border to Tucson. And then during the Mexican Revolution, many more Yaquis came north to these nascent villages that were being established in the Tucson area and at Guadalupe, south of Phoenix. They start to ask for land in the 60s. They finally get dedicated land in 1964, the Constitution in 1988, and historic status in 1994. And here we are now, and the Yaqui are a recognized tribe with a recognized language program and cultural traditions that far exceed this timeline. And so this gives you some background to the history of people who came north to the United States basically as displaced persons and claimed the land and made it their own. This map gives you an idea of the traditional homelands of the Yaquis in Sonora and the migratory and present-day homelands of Yaqui in Arizona. It's important to remember that the Yaqui predated Spanish contact on this continent and were migratory peoples who traveled following crops and different kinds of game, and then finally settled in these two sets of riverine communities along the Rio Yaqui between Guaymas and Ciudad Obregón in the lower right of your map, and in Hermosillo along the Rio Sonora. And then after the events discussed in the timeline, moving northward, New Pascua, Barrio Libre, Old Pascua, Marana, and Guadalupe up on the Salt River just south of Phoenix. So now you have a fairly good idea of the distribution of peoples, both north and south, on both sides of the border. The background to this project is an abusive history of tourist and for-profit photography of Yaqui Easter ceremonies, which, as I mentioned before, are the most sacred part of the Yaqui religious year. And there were postcards sold for sale. People were encouraged by the city to go to Pascua and film the ceremonies or take pictures of them, without any sensitivity to the village and its particular concerns and needs. In 1940s, Tad Nichols, who had been a student of anthropology at the University of Arizona, shot for his former teacher, anthropologist Ned Spicer, a film of the Yaqui ceremony. And the film was shot surreptitiously, but with permission from some members of the community. By surreptitiously, I mean that Tad was very careful not to put the camera out in the middle of the crowd. He often covered the camera with his hat and shot, under his arm, so as not to make the community members uncomfortable. Most people knew that he was taking the film, and it was seen as, at the time, 1940, as an act of cultural preservation, as the forces of industrialization and modern life were impinging on Yaqui traditional ways. Some members of the community felt that there needed to be a record of these ceremonies in case people who knew how to conduct them passed on or the traditions were lost. So this is a contested issue. The film was taken with some cooperation and some permission and some consent, but not all members of the community were happy about it. And because it was shot with federal money for a university, it has entered into public collections. As a result, we find this film on the left in the Arizona State Museum and the video on the right in the University of Arizona libraries. And if you click to the next pane, you can read the labels more directly. And you'll see that, they aren't like out on the shelves for browsing, but they are available to people to access and research without any cautionary statements or language. And here we find a record from NAU's Klein Library, Special Collections and Archives, for the Yaqui Easter film by Tad Nichols, not labeled as sacred material at all. And this particular frame capture is better than most. It shows people's backs. It doesn't show faces. But nonetheless, the record doesn't contain any kind of notation about the fact that this is sacred material and shouldn't be viewed by everyone for entertainment. So while this project started as a simple repatriation, if that can ever be simple, a simple project to scan the existing reels of film and repatriate them to the community with culturally sensitive metadata, it raised collateral issues about culturally sensitive material on film in public collections and out there for the public to view without any awareness of image sovereignty rights for Native peoples. So Hani and I developed a presentation for the Association of Moving Image Archivists last fall and spoke with them about these issues of identifying culturally sensitive material on film. And this may be of interest to the CERCLL community, who may not have confronted, but certainly probably will at some point, this particular issue. So culturally sensitive material on film, there's a lot of film of ceremonies, especially before mid-century, and you should be mindful of that if you find it in your research or in collections that you supervise or visit. Surreptitious camera work is definitely a way to identify culturally sensitive material, because people who took the images knew that they weren't supposed to be doing it. There are often language issues, offensive terminology in English. There can be indigenous language recordings in audio recordings in collections, and those need to be handled as culturally sensitive by people who don't know what's on them. The paper record in the anthropological literature can be a good guide to what might be culturally sensitive. And then tribal cultural preservation offices and websites can also be a guide if you come across something and you're not sure that it's culturally sensitive. You can always consult, and that's part of our message as this project moved forward. Consult, consult, consult. Guidance in this area is offered by the Protocols for Native American Archival Material, an incredible document that was put together by a group of Native, First Nations, and Indigenous archivists around the world in 2007, and it's actually hosted on the server at NAU. You see the URL there at the bottom of the pane. I encourage you to take a look at it if you're doing any kind of work with Native peoples at all, whether it's archival material or otherwise, because the spirit of the protocols is precisely the spirit that you should embrace if you enter into a project involving Native peoples. There's a long history of exploitation, and you certainly don't want to extend it. So internalizing the protocols is a really good way to go into a project with the spirit of cooperation and partnership expected from Native communities. These are some general best practices that come out of the protocols and also evolved from our project with Old Pascua. So identifying the material obviously is the first step. Consult at every stage of the activity. If you come across moving or still image records that don't belong to you and represent Native people, repatriate or repurpose. In other words, give them back to the Native community or help them to repurpose them in ways that are appropriate to their particular cultural needs. So one way to do that is through controlled access through a CMS, content management system. And Mukudu is an open source software that is basically a database into which you can put photographs, oral recordings, videos, and Mukudu is an Aboriginal word that means safekeeping place. What it does is allow for different levels of access. So complete outsiders can see certain things. As you move into the community, depending on your level of initiation, you can have access to more and more and more information. The elders obviously have the most access, and children probably the least, except for outsiders, of course. So it's a controlled community of practice in that sense. And then tribe sourcing, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. Tribe sourcing is a term I came up with to describe the effort to bring moving image records back into Native communities that are represented in these films and videos. Like crowdsourcing, it seeks broad community input, and it returns the source of information to the community. So the notion being that if you find a film that was shot in a Native community without, or maybe even with, permission at a different historical time, you take the film back to the community and ask members of the community to record a new narration so that it isn't an authoritative voice of God narration from outside the community, but actually a narration that is culturally informed and culturally competent. In that way, it provides an insider's counter-narrative, and coming from within the community, it determines what information is public and private. And that's really the essence of our project with these two National Geographic films. There's important visual information on these films. Many of the people in them have passed by now, and practices have changed over time. So it is a record, but it's a record that should be within the control of the community and explained by the community for the community. So Tribesourcing returns these films to the image sovereignty of the community and asks the community members to say what they want to say about the images on the screen rather than being dictated by an outside National Geographic narrator. Here you see two frame captures from the 1940-41 Tad Nichols film, and these are images that we were given permission to use for our public presentation. In the frame on the left, you see part of the procession around the village, and Guillermo says he thinks this was shot from the roof of the church, given the background images and the way in which the procession is proceeding. And so, again, Tad Nichols is not getting in the face of the participants in the ritual and is maintaining a discreet distance. In the 1972 National Geographic film, a scaffolding was actually built at the east end of the plaza in front of the church to capture the Saturday ceremony, the Gloria, and that is really not okay. You know, that is just outright commodification of a highly sacred ritual and not appropriate behavior during any kind of religious ritual. In the frame on the right, we see matachin dancers whose dance involves pivoting and turning. And so we don't want to overcorrect by reading this as an image of active resistance against the camera. On the other hand, we will see we do see in the 72 film some people turning their backs and refusing to engage with the camera as an act of resistance to this kind of violation of image sovereignty, violation of personal space and privacy, violation of religious privacy. All of those things happened with the 1972 film that's the focus of our project. National Geographic extracted a portion of the 1972 film and sold it to a television program called The Haunted West, in which it was played with two other segments during a half-hour television show in the early 70s. As you see from this image, which is quite close up, the camera is right in the faces of these people. This little boy looks extremely unhappy about what's going on, and he wouldn't probably be feeling that way about the religious ritual that's taking place. The two men wearing sunglasses wore sunglasses all the time, which guards their privacy a little bit, actually. But remember that these are people carrying religious objects, and a camera is thrust in their faces during their ritual. And think about how you would feel if someone had a camera right up in your face during your particular communion with your deity. It's intrusive and exploitative and really quite colonialist, and a serious problem that, first of all, National Geographic shot it, and second, that they extracted and sold a portion of it to yet another broadcast medium. One of the outcomes of our project was this document, Guidelines for Handling of Culturally Sensitive Materials by or about the Yaqui Yaqui. Again, as I said, we started out just to digitize these films and repatriate them to the community, but projects have a tendency to ripple outwards, and this particular document, which is highlighted in the next two frames, will give you an idea of one of the really positive outcomes of this project, which was the generation of this document that provides guidelines. It's sort of a subset, right, of the protocols. Provides guidelines for people working with Yaqui material that may or may not be culturally sensitive. Most researchers aren't really sure, and so this provides a kind of roadmap to encountering these materials and how to respectfully engage with the community about materials that one might find or wish to use. As you see, the guidelines involve recommendations that host institutions carefully identify in catalogs, finding aids, LibGuides, indexes, and all public points of access materials that are culturally sensitive, that access needs to go on a case-by-case basis, and that digitization should be avoided until the traditional leadership has been consulted. And for public institutions like university libraries or anthropology collections, there is often a rush to digitize simply because some money came available and you need to spend it and you need to get these moving images preserved. Some film is deteriorating and needs to be digitized before it completely loses image quality. But again, the leadership needs to be consulted, and they need to, not just the political leadership, but the cultural leadership needs to be consulted. And the concluding 2 points of this document are that staff education within information repositories should include observation and training within the best practices in relation to native and specifically Yaqui materials, and that new staff, indeed the public, are welcome and encouraged to visit Pascua and learn about the community so that that knowledge can go back into sensitive handling of cultural materials within public institutions. So finally, the project outcomes for this CERCLL grant are that we digitized 2 reels of 16mm film, and the films and the digital surrogates have been returned to the community. Tribe-sourced a new narration of the footage. There will be Yaqui Spanish and English narration tracks, and those will be merged in the Makudu site, which is in preparation, with particularized access levels for members of the general public and then members of the community at different levels depending on their cultural knowledge, age, and initiation into various religious societies. And then the guidelines document was approved by the Old Pascua Tribal Council. So this, we feel, has been a successful project. There are always little things left to do when you do a film project, but by and large we have completed and are so grateful to CERCLL for the funding to conduct this project, which is ultimately not just a cultural preservation project, but a language preservation project blended together with a film preservation project. So in that sense, it's been highly successful. And again, we thank you for the funding to achieve this.